Um, so welcome everyone to the AI reading group by Women in AI and Robotics. My name is Cleo Norris, and we're really excited to create a space where an audience can connect with researchers to really discuss and learn about current research being done in the field, and to give this opportunity to everyone who's interested. So with that, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker. His name is Jan Teusen, who started his academic journey in cognitive science and computational neuroscience, which sparked his interest in Bayesian machine learning. During his PhD, he focused on developing and applying Bayesian methods to tackle questions in computational neuroscience, while also working on tools to make simulation-based inference more accessible to researchers. In 2024, he joined the appliedAI Institute for Europe, where he continues to explore ways to make advanced methodologies both practical and impactful. Today, he'll be presenting the paper, Flexible and Efficient Simulation-Based Inference for Models of Decision-Making. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Jan up to the stage.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction, Cleo. Let me share my screen for the presentation. Here we go. And just a second. Okay. So I hope you can see the presentation.
Yeah,
First slide. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm really happy and honored to give this talk here in the reading group. I think it's a really cool format, and I hope this will be interesting for many of you, and we will have a nice discussion afterwards. But also, I want to stress that you can also interrupt me anytime in between if you have questions on what I'm presenting. I also have some like breaks in between for asking questions, but you really raise your hand or say something, and then I'm happy to take questions anytime. Okay, so a bit about me. Okay, you heard already my background is in cognitive science and my bachelor's, and then I moved on to computational neuroscience because I was really interested in mathematical modeling and how we can understand information processing in the brain. And then doing a master's, I kind of it really sparked my interest in Bayesian machine learning or machine learning in general. So I kind of moved a bit away from like actual neuroscience, but more towards AI for science. So I wanted to develop methods that help the scientific workflow. And yeah, that's why I did my PhD in Tübingen with Jakob Macke, and where I mostly developed Bayesian machine learning methods for problems in neuroscience. And then, since a bit more than a year, I'm an AI researcher at the Transfer Lab. And the Transfer Lab is part of the appliedAI Institute for Europe. And it's kind of the research team at the appliedAI Institute. And what we do is really we try to support the European AI landscape or ecosystem by providing software. So we contribute to open source software packages to make like state-of-the-art machine learning methods more accessible for practitioners by providing good and well-documented software. And we also provide insights into recent research topics by writing paper summaries or blog posts. And we also do some teaching or trainings for professionals. So if you're interested in what we do, have a look at our website. That's transferlab.ai. And as part of my work, I'm also the maintainer of a popular SPI Python package, so a Python package for performing simulation-based inference. And I'm also really happy if you want to get in touch, just message me on LinkedIn or on Blue Sky. Yes. All right, then let's get started with the actual thing for today. So that's the paper was actually my first paper in the PhD. So I'm really happy that now I have again the opportunity to talk about this work. And the paper is titled Flexible and Efficient Simulation-Based Inference for Models of Decision-Making. This is work I did together with my colleagues Jan Matthias Lügmann, Richard Gau, and Jakob Macke. And before I dive into the paper itself or into the topic of the paper, I first wanted to give a brief introduction to simulation-based inference because that's kind of the main topic of the paper, although the application is in decision-making modeling. But SPI, I want to give this short introduction. All right, so in general, if you look at the scientific workflow or like scientific procedure, in most fields, in most scientific fields, we are using computer simulations, right? So all across the spectrum of the sciences, from particle physics all the way to astrophysics, most of the time we are using computer simulations to better understand the processes that we want to research about. And today, of course, our application is in neuroscience, and we will come to this later. But I want to give an introduction or like a conceptual introduction to this simulation-based approach using an example from epidemiology. And for that, I'm going back a couple of years to the COVID-19 pandemic. And now this picture is from like the news in Germany, but I guess across the world, everyone like was seeing these pictures kind of every day in the news, where we saw the number of infections in different regions in the country. And there were some predictions on how the COVID-19 uh, virus will develop over time. Based on that, there were some political decisions and so on. And this is really a nice example of how computational modeling can be used to make these decisions, right? Because how did they make these decisions? They In the background there were scientists and experts developing mathematical models to better understand the dynamics of COVID-19. So one example of a model for epidemiology is the so-called SIR model, where we assume that there are three populations: the susceptible people, the infected people, and the recovered people. And then there are some transition rates between these groups. So there's an infection rate, beta, so some model parameters. And now the idea of the simulation-based approach is that we have these observed data, in this case, the number of cases over time in Germany. And in the plot, you can see this data in blue. And then we have this computational model, and we want to kind of tweak or tune the parameters of the model such that we can explain the data that we have observed. And then we can make predictions in the future by using the model. Then, yeah, of course, the model now is shown in green here. So to zoom out, this entire simulation-based modeling approach, it starts with a problem that we want to understand, in this case, the COVID-19 virus. And then, yeah, we have some observed data, and we have a model, in our case, the SIR model. And then we fit the model to the data. And when we succeed in fitting the model to the data, then we can draw conclusions and make predictions, and this will even cause like political decisions and so on. Now, of course, the crucial part here is fitting the model to the data. That's the main focus of simulation-based inference. So the central challenge across science and computational modeling is finding model parameters. To reiterate, so we have some model, the SIR model in this case, some observed data, and we want to fit the model parameters. We want to tune them, in this case, beta and gamma, to reproduce or explain the observed data. Now, there are different approaches to this. We can, kind of a practical or naive approach would be just finding the single best fitting parameters. So we could either use hand tuning or some grid search or optimization methods, genetic algorithms or something. And then we would try to find this point in parameter space that can explain the data well. So in this two-dimensional space, beta and gamma, we would find this one point and say, okay, this parameter combination explains the data well, so we will use it downstream. But now the problem with this approach is that there might be different solutions. So then there might be another combination of parameters that fits the data equally well, because maybe there are some interactions between parameters, some compensation mechanisms. And even more so, there might be like many combinations of parameters that ideally we can find them all. So the ideal approach would be to be able to quantify the uncertainty that we have with our parameter estimate and to find all solutions within the parameter space, and maybe even to quantify the relation between the parameters. And that's really important because if we in the scientific domain, we often have meaningful parameters, so some physical parameters. In this case, the beta is the infection rate. All right. And there is such a principled approach. Or there are many, well, there are some, but one of them is Bayesian inference. And here the idea is to use this mathematical framework of Bayesian statistics to obtain more trustworthy or more principled parameter estimates. And the central assumption is that we say that the data x and the parameters theta are random variables. And then our goal changes mathematically. Now the goal is not to find a single point in the parameter space, but to find a distribution over the parameters theta conditioned on x, so a conditional distribution. And then this object, this distribution, has really nice properties because it characterizes all the suitable parameters because it just assigns them with the probability of how well they can explain the data. And it naturally quantifies uncertainty, kind of the variance, the spread of the distribution. And this distribution, we can obtain it using Bayes' rule. So this goes back, among others, to Thomas Bayes quite some time ago. And this distribution is called the posterior distribution. So the conditional distribution over theta given x. And this Bayes rule tells us that we can get this distribution by combining the prior, which is really our prior knowledge or expectation for the parameters, and the likelihood. And the likelihood is really defined by the simulator, by our model. So our hypothesis, how this process is working. All right. So now let's say we want to apply this approach to the SIR model. So we define a prior distribution over our parameters, so over beta and gamma. Our initial assumption, maybe some physically constrained boundaries, because we know that the parameters cannot take other values. And then we can perform this forward model, so the simulation. We can just draw a random sample from the prior and simulate the corresponding data using the SIR model. And this way is usually quite cheap, right? We can just simulate data using our simulator. Now the goal is to perform inference, to go the other way around, right? In the end, if we want to make predictions, we usually have some observed data, and we want to know the underlying parameters. So this is the inference step, the inverse model. And this is usually quite challenging to do. But as I said, so Bayes' rule tells us how to do it. We have to combine, kind of mathematically combine the prior distribution and the likelihood to obtain this posterior distribution. Now, the problem is that this likelihood object is really a mathematical object. And usually if we have the scientific simulators, which can be just a computer program where we have no mathematical access to, or the likelihood is really expensive to evaluate, then this object is not available. And therefore we cannot obtain the posterior. Or like more practically, we cannot use so if we have access to the likelihood of a model, then we can use standard machine learning methods or statistical methods like Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling or variation inference. But for scientific simulators, it's usually not the case that we can access the likelihood, and therefore it's really not possible to use these methods. Now, the idea of simulation-based inference is that we can use machine learning instead. So we use machine learning to perform inference. And the idea is, okay, given that this forward model is kind of cheap, we can just draw from the prior and simulate data. We can create a data set of a training data set of pairs of theta and the corresponding simulated data x. So we just run the simulator many times and save both the prior sample and the corresponding simulated data sample. And this is our training data set. And then we use specialized machine learning methods to use this training data to learn to approximate the posterior distribution without accessing the likelihood. We just use these machine learning methods. All right. So this was a brief, like high-level introduction to simulation-based inference. And are there any questions? Okay, cool. Then I will continue. And now we actually come to the actual application of the paper, namely to this neuroscience, this subfield of neuroscience, decision-making modeling. And just generally speaking, if we want to study decision-making in the brain, so we want to understand how the processes work that help us to make decisions, then that's a really challenging task, right? So because our decision processes are really complex, we make lots of different decisions, low-level decisions, high-level decisions, and so on. So from like if we want to really study this, usually we try to simplify the problem quite a bit. So for example, we would focus on studying perceptual decision making. So for example, like a very typical task is this random dot motion task. So someone sits in front of a screen and has these clouds of dots that move around randomly, but not entirely randomly because there's some tendency to move to one or the other direction. And now the decision-making task is to decide whether the dots, like overall or on average, are moving to the left or to the right, or up or down, like usually a binary decision. And this is like a highly idealized task to study the perceptual decision making. So for example, like a participant would fixate on the screen, and then there would be like target at some point there would appear this cloud of moving dots, and then they have to decide whether the dots move on average to the left or to the right. In this case, they actually have to make a saccade, so they have to indicate with the eye movement whether it's left or right. All right, so then the behavioral data that we are recording when we conduct these experiments, it's usually reaction time and the choice, right? So we record the reaction time and whether the participants set it up or down. So the observed data X is the reaction time and the choice. Now, the usual setup is also that we repeat these experiments over many trials just to accumulate enough data. Then also, of course, we want to understand the neural processes behind this. So we make some neural recordings in parallel. So we either record from single cells or maybe use less invasive methods like EEG or MEG while we conduct these experiments. For example, in one paper, they used single cell recordings in monkeys. So they were recording from single cells while the monkey performs this task, and then they would obtain these traces of neurons. So these traces really show when a neuron sends a signal, like a spike, and then they would try to understand how different neurons respond to this task. Very like high level speaking. Okay, so to repeat, we have now from the simulation-based perspective, now we have this data, the reaction time and choices, and maybe some neural data that we record on the side. And we have the setup that we have many repetitions of the same experimental setting. So we have many trials. So our capital X is just a set of trials that we conduct for a particular experimental session or subject. And this will become important later on. Now, okay, looking back at the simulation-based approach from before, now we want to kind of understand this data. So we decide for a computational model, and one well-known model in this field is the so-called drift diffusion model that is used to model decision-making processes. And this is really like a phenomenological model of this process. So the idea is that we have a decision variable that starts at zero and just evolves over time. And it kind of integrates sensory evidence. So when the subject thinks the dots move up, then it kind of moves up with some noise. And then at one point it hits a decision boundary, and then the decision is made. That's the idea of the model. And mathematically, this can be described as a stochastic differential equation, where we have this drift term that kind of represents the sensory evidence over time. And then we have the noise term that just adds some noise on top. So for example, we could follow like the up decisions are now colored in light red here. So we would, when we like one trial corresponds to one line here, and then there would be like on average the points would be moving up. So there would be kind of a drift towards the upside, and then there's some noise, and eventually it hits the boundary. And we have more parameters in this model. So we have the drift, the sense of evidence, kind of, and then we have the boundary separation. So how far apart these boundaries are. So kind of how fast the subject will make a decision based on evidence. And also some initial offset. So maybe there's a bias towards one side even before starting the trial, and some non-decision time, tau, just like a non-response time at the beginning, kind of a waiting period. So that's our model. The diffusion model in the simplified version has this stochastic differential equation, and the theta vector has four entries, these four parameters. Okay. Now this slide just shows, just to give you an impression, kind of the landscape of diffusion models, because there are lots of different variants of this model. So right now we looked at this simple diffusion model with only four parameters, but there are many different variants of this model. It doesn't matter so much, but just to show you, of course, we can extend this model to make it more flexible or to explain different aspects and so on. Now, the crucial part is looking back at this Bayesian inference perspective. If we want to perform Bayesian inference, we need access to the likelihood of the model. So the mathematical expression, or yeah, the mathematical expression of the likelihood. And only this very simple model, simple variant of the diffusion model has access to the analytical likelihood. And all other models are kind of maybe we have access, but it's really a bit cumbersome. So therefore, it's really important. Well, we cannot really apply standard Bayesian inference method, but we have to apply SPI. All right. So to repeat again, so if we want to do Bayesian inference for the diffusion model, we have again this forward model. Now we have the prior over these four parameters, and we can draw random points from the prior and then simulate the diffusion model, and you obtain different traces here and different reaction times and choices. Now we want to do Bayesian inference for some observed data, so some set of trials for one subject. But yeah, as I said, most variants of this model in practice, we cannot access the likelihood, so we have to do this this machine learning approach, simulation-based inference. That's our goal. Okay. Now, maybe you're wondering, okay, this because the diffusion model and the decision-making research field is quite old, and there are like many people working on this. So you might wonder, okay, nice idea, but hasn't this been done before? Really, because it's kind of obvious thing to do. And the answer is yes. So there's this method called likelihood approximation networks, or LANs. And it's really an SPI approach for diffusion models. And the idea is to train a neural network to learn the likelihood function. And then afterwards, when we have learned the likelihood function, we do MCMC. So this really sounds like SPI, how I introduced it before. So this neural network would take as input some like a combination of theta and x, the parameters and the corresponding reaction time and choices. And then we would train it such that it approximates the corresponding likelihood value for this combination of theta and x. Now, because we are really doing neural network regression in this case, so we have some input, we have the target variable, and we trying to do like supervised learning in a way, right? So this neural network needs likelihood training targets. So it needs the actual likelihood values to perform the neural network training. And in this likelihood approximation network method, before they train the network, they have to kind of develop or like construct these training targets. So what they do is they use this method called kernel density estimation to obtain these likelihood targets for every training sample. For every training parameter, they need to perform kernel density estimation to approximate the likelihood using simulations. And then once they have constructed the training data set, then they can train the neural network, and then they have their approximation to the likelihood. So yeah, in mathematical terms, we obtain these training targets by performing KDE on a set of simulations from the model. And this is really like there's one central difference to the SPI approach, how I explained it before. Namely, they do not perform density estimation because they're performing neural network regression. Maybe this is not entirely not completely clear yet, but I hope later in the talk it will become clearer, and the difference might seem really small, but it actually makes a big difference in the end. Okay, so that's kind of how we approach this paper, really. We read the paper by Fengler et al., so this likelihood approximation network paper. And then we thought, okay, that's really interesting. They do SPI for models of decision making. That's cool, but then we were wondering about how they do it. And then, okay, we thought, okay, it makes more sense to actually use density estimation, to use this method called neural likelihood estimation instead, because we thought it's probably way more efficient. And that's why we then sat down and started this project, and the outcome in the end was this paper. Kind of is the history for this paper. Okay, please do interrupt me if there are any questions. Okay, so this neural likelihood approach, it's just one variant of simulation-based inference. As I said, in simulation-based inference, the idea is that we use a neural network to approximate, we use a specialized neural network to approximate the procedure or the likelihood itself. And again, the idea is that we can use the prior and the simulator to generate training data. And now the central thing is that we use an artificial neural network to approximate the likelihood itself. Because that's a difference to neural network regression. We use a density estimation network that is constructed, the architecture is constructed such that it approximates a distribution directly. So we learn directly the distribution parameters, and we don't need targets. The target is really the probability of our distribution itself. So the network takes this input theta, and the output is a distribution over x conditioned on theta. So the likelihood approximation. And please notice the difference between the LAN method now. And in this case, we only input theta and not x. And then as a loss function for this network, we evaluate our distribution approximator using x and theta. One example would be for this Q, we could, for example, use a Gaussian distribution. Now, if you used a Gaussian distribution, of course, that's a very strong assumption, but we would just say, okay, the likelihood is Gaussian. We just have to learn the mean and the variance of this Gaussian distribution. And then the output layer of this neural network would just be the mean values and the variance values given the input theta. So the network would learn to associate input theta with corresponding means and variances for our Gaussian. And therefore, we don't need targets. We don't need likelihood targets. And of course, in practice, we do not use a Gaussian, but we use maybe a mixture of Gaussians to make it more flexible. Or nowadays, we probably would use a normalizing flow, which is a more powerful density estimator. Okay, and then once we have finished training, we have our likelihood approximation. So our own version of the likelihood trained using the simulated data. And then we can use standard Bayesian inference tools like Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling or variational inference to obtain posterior samples. Okay. Now, we want to apply this approach to the drift diffusion model. And given the experimental setup of these drift diffusion models or of decision-making models in general, these models, we can simulate data, but often these models are kind of expensive, right? So it takes some time to simulate data. So ideally, we want to be efficient. We want to use few training simulations. And then we also want to be flexible because, as I said, usually we are dealing with many participants in the experiments, and they're all doing different number of trials. So we want to do inference, we want to obtain the model parameters given different sizes of data, so different sets of trials. And then the advanced, okay, yeah. So our observed data usually is a set of trials, and this number m here might be different for different subjects. So we need some flexibility. Now, the advantage of neural likelihood estimation is that we can actually train it on single trial, on single trials. So during training, we don't have to simulate many trials for every training sample, but we can just simulate one trial for one parameter, and that's our training sample. And then at inference time, when we want to do Bayesian inference for a given observed data, we can actually, even though we have trained on single trials, we can just plug in the entire set of trials. And the assumption behind this is that the trials are IID, so they're independently distributed. And you might have seen this kind of IID trick from maybe from maximum likelihood estimation or something. So the idea is if we calculate the likelihood of a set of trials and the trials are independent, then we can just factor out the likelihoods, right? Instead of calculating the likelihood for the entire set of trials, we can just take the product for all the individual trials. And that's why if we have the set of trials and we want to use our SPI approach, we can just take the product over the individual trials. And therefore, we only need to train on individual trials. That's the idea. Okay, but this was the plan, but of course there was a challenge in this research project, and the challenge was that the data that we are dealing with is mixed data. So duration times are real numbers or real positive numbers, so just time, and the choices are discrete because it's up or down, or maybe there are more choices, but it's always like a categorical variable. And that's really a problem because it's really challenging, technically challenging to estimate a distribution that is mixed in data types. It's really not really possible to do it in one step. So then we had different ideas. The first naive idea would be that we encode the sign, so plus or minus, of the reaction time. So if we have this two-dimensional mixed data, so we have two distributions of reaction times, one distribution for the down choice and one distribution for the up choice. So we have the reaction times and this binary choice variable. Instead of using this representation, the idea was to just say, okay, now we just say the down choice gets a minus in front of the reaction time, so minus reaction time, and then we can just display it on the real line, right? So then we can say, okay, the down choice is now just has a negative reaction time, and the up choice has a positive reaction time, and like this we can just show it on the real line in one dimension. And now we can, because this is now all continuous, now we can do density estimation. But this didn't really work so well because the density estimation model now would have to learn this really hard cutoffs here, right? So we want to fit a distribution to these two histograms or to this one histogram, and then it has to really learn these really sharp cutoffs here. And this is really challenging for density estimation methods. Imagine if you want to fit two Gaussians to these two histograms, then usually the Gaussian would kind of go like this or here as well, and it would not be a good fit. So specifically, the small reaction times here would not be represented well. And also, if there are more than two choices, it's not so easy to represent it in this way, right? Because, yeah, how to represent more than two choices on the real line. So the next idea was to learn the separate likelihoods for the choice and for the reaction time. So and this was actually our solution then. So in order to perform mixed neural likelihood estimation, we would learn separate density estimators for the reaction time and for the choice. And here comes the crucial part. The idea is that we can just factorize the likelihood, right? If we want to approximate the likelihood over the reaction time and the choice, we just separate the problems. We first approximate the likelihood over the choices, And then we approximate the likelihood over the reaction times, but we also condition on the choice as well. And by using this conditioning, we can make sure that we don't just learn separate density estimators, but the second one depends on the first one. So there can be some interaction between these two variables. From the neural network perspective, this looks like this. So we put in some parameters, in this case, just A and V, and then we would have one network that learns the relationship from the parameters to the choice. And then we would have another network that gets in the parameters and the learned choice, and then outputs the reaction time. And then overall, we would output the reaction time and the choice. And then if we have this representation of our likelihood, then we can just use Bayes' rule and then do MCMC or variational inference. Yeah, that's the visual summary of this. So once we have trained this, we combine it with our prior and our actually observed data, and we obtain the posterior samples. Okay, that's really the core of this mixed neural likelihood estimation method. Are there any questions?
There is one question from Hugging Face. It's when you say choice in what you've just been talking about, you're talking about the probability distribution, correct?
No, when I say choice, I really mean the choice in the diffusion model. So for the subject, whether the subject said left or right or up or down.
Mhm. Okay.
And then the distribution I'm learning, so this distribution here, it's the distribution over the choice, so it's a categorical distribution.
Okay, thank you. Oh yeah, perfect. That answered the question.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Cool. Are there more questions? Yes. There's a question in the chat. The question is, I read in the paper that the training is amortized. Could you explain what that actually means? Yeah, really good question. So the idea of this amortization is, I think it's a term it's also used in finance. And the idea is that we have some high initial cost, right? We have invest some time, some resources, but this cost amortizes over time because we can kind of this cost amortizes over time. Full stop. And in this context, this means that we have to invest into training this new network. We have to generate lots of simulated data that takes some resources, and then we have to train the network. But once the network is trained, we can apply it to different data, to different observations, to different subjects, and so on. So we can, once we have this approximation of the likelihood, we can really apply it to different subjects. And that's what we mean with amortization. I think in other methods, it's often the case that we would have to retrain for every new observation, for example. Okay. Just to make sure, are there any more questions before we move on to the results?
I think not right now, but we can come back, of course.
Okay, cool. All right, so then the first observation or the first result is that this method, mixed neural likelihood estimation, returns accurate synthetic data. And that's a really nice property. And it really, here this density estimation approach really enables this. And I hope this becomes clear because I think it's really nice. So this mixed neural likelihood estimation learns an actual density. So actually an actual distribution object like a PyTorch distribution or a SciPy distribution object. And then this object we can sample from and we can evaluate. And if we sample from it, because it's an approximation to the likelihood. So if we sample from it, we condition on theta and we have a distribution in X, so we obtain synthetic data given this parameter theta. So in Python code, we have this object MNLE, which is our density estimator, and it has this method called sample, and we can say, okay, now we want to sample 1,000 samples, conditioned So given our parameter vector theta. And then we would obtain this x, which would be 1,000 samples of reaction times and choices. And this happens without running the diffusion model. So we have an emulator of our simulator. We can generate synthetic data without running the simulation. Just by conditioning on one parameter, we can obtain the corresponding synthetic data. That's the sampling of the likelihood. And the other one is the evaluation. So we can evaluate this object, this density estimator object. And this gives us the likelihood approximation, so the log probability of the likelihood. So then we will call MNLE.logprob, and we would give it a set of data, observed data, and the corresponding parameters theta, and then we would obtain the log probability of the likelihood. And sorry. And this step is really what enables us to perform MCMC and variational inference, to just treat this object just like a distribution object as if we had the likelihood. Okay, cool. And the second key result that we obtained is that MNLE is very simulation efficient. So if and for this simple diffusion model that I introduced earlier, we can actually calculate the analytical likelihood, right? So then we can just compare how well our MNLE does. So we would compare it against the analytical solution, and we also compare it to the likelihood approximation networks, this other method. And the result is shown in the plot. So we have the reaction times on the x-axis, where we actually use this representation where we flipped the sign of one of the choices to show it in 1D, just to not confuse you. And then we have the probability of the different reaction times and choices on the y-axis. And we see in blue the analytical likelihood, and then the other colors show the different methods. So in green, we see MNLE, and the different shades of orange show the LAN method for different settings. And these settings are really important, because if we compare the simulation efficiency, so how many training simulations we used, and that's really important because this is kind of our investment, our cost that we have to invest, then MNLE really needs only 100,000 simulations to obtain this kind of accurate approximation to the likelihood. But the LAN method needs 100 million simulations, or even, no, it's one, right? So it's 100 billion. So these different shades of orange just show the LAN method for 10 to the 5, 10 to the 8, and 10 to the 11. And this is really a big difference, right? So this is just 1 million times more simulations. Okay. And then, of course, now we looked at the likelihood approximations. In the end, we want to do inference. We want to obtain the posterior for our parameters. So therefore, we also tested how accurate the posteriors are that we obtain with MNLE. Of course, we know that these MCC methods that we use, they work. So if we have a good likelihood approximation, then the posterior will also be good. But of course, we had to check. So now we see, again, we can obtain the reference, so using the analytical likelihood, and we compare it against the LAN with 100 billion simulations, and MNLE with 100,000 simulations. And we also know the ground truth parameter that analyzes this data. So we have 4 parameters. We have 100 trials for this observation, and then we can see they all kind of match, and they all recover the ground truth parameters. So this is the one-dimensional posterior for each parameter, and the priors that we used were actually uniform. So in the beginning it's flat, but the method is able to recover these parameters given the observed data. And now one thing that we haven't really talked about is that the big advantage of Bayesian inference is that we obtain this like full posterior distribution. So we obtain the 4-dimensional distribution object. In this case, we can only show the 2-dimensional marginals, but we can actually see how this distribution look like in 2-dimensional space as well, like the interaction between different parameters. And we might see there's some correlations between parameter V and the parameter W. And in most scientific models, these correlations they do have some meaning because the parameters have some meaning and there's maybe some interaction between parameters or some compensation mechanisms. So that's really cool. It's really cool to have access to the full posterior distribution. And now if we look at the metrics, we compare some like evaluation metrics between the reference posterior and our methods. For example, the mean error, so how far apart the means of the posteriors are compared to the reference posterior. And we also see that overall MNLE does really well. Also the variance error, so how accurate we can approximate the variance, and the estimation error is just how accurate we can recover the parameters, right? And yeah, across the board we see that MNLE does really well, but using 1 million times fewer simulations. Okay, and of course I'm not here to bash the LAN method because of course there's a reason, right? Why does LAN why are LANs so inefficient? And this result is kind of really strong because we are measuring it in simulation efficiency. In cases where the simulation efficiency is not important, of course, then LAN is totally valid method, right? If we don't care about number of simulations, maybe our simulator is really cheap, we can just create tons of simulations, then it's totally fine to use LAN. However, I want to use this point to stress this difference between regression, neural network regression, and density estimation. So to reiterate, learning the likelihood using neural network regression requires training targets. So we have to use, or they need to run kernel density estimation or another method for every parameter in the training data set. And KDE itself needs a lot of simulations. So for each theta I in the training data set, they have to simulate m times. And now they're training the LAN with a training data set of n. And so they need m times n simulations. So for every n, they need to simulate m times to perform this KDE. And for the DM, they use 1.5 million training simulations and 100,000 iterations for the KDE. So overall, they need 150 billion or 100 billion simulations. That's the reason. So in a way, they actually do density estimation. So when they perform KDE, they do density estimation, but they do it unconditionally. So they do it for every training point separately and only to obtain the targets. And then they save the targets and they throw away the KDE object. So they don't use the density estimation. The neural likelihood estimation, so our approach, we train a neural network that is conditional on the parameter, right? So it gets a parameter and it learns to associate the parameter with the corresponding likelihood. And therefore we can just reuse this data and this neural network for all the different parameters. So I hope for some of you, or for most of you, it's clear this difference between neural network regression and density estimation, because it's kind of the key difference between these two methods, and it shows how much more efficient the neural network or the neural density estimation approach can be. Okay, so let me summarize. This mixed neural likelihood estimation enables neural likelihood estimation for models with mixed data, right? So we had this challenge that, of course, we want to apply standard likelihood estimation methods, but it's not possible because the data is both continuous and discrete. So we had to come up with this variant where we combine these two different density estimators. So we train a neural density estimator for categorical and for continuous data separately, and then we combine them. And we can do this directly on the simulated data, and we don't need likelihood targets. And because we don't need likelihood targets, we can be way more simulation efficient, at least compared to LAN. And another property is that we return this emulator. So because we can sample our likelihood object that we have learned, we can generate synthetic data. And this is usually way cheaper than running the simulation. And then yeah, given this mixed neural likelihood object, we can then use MCMC and we can apply this flexibly, right? So we can vary the number of trials, we can do it for different subjects and so on. That's really a big advantage for these experimental setups, how they occur in decision-making research. All right. And then, of course, this has been, I think, yeah, a bit more than 3 years that we developed this method. So what happened since then? And I think one big, one big development is that this MNLE is now fully implemented in the SBI toolbox. So it's really easy for users or for practitioners to use this method. Just a couple of lines in PyTorch and Python, and we have lots of documentation and tutorials on that in this SBI Python package. So it's really nicely accessible. And we also developed it a bit further. Initially, it was only possible to use two different variables, or to use two different choices. Now we have changed the architecture that you can actually use many different choices. For example, you could apply to a diffusion model that has 4 different choices. And then we also extended the approach to posterior inference, posterior approximation. So the method that how I showed it now is really approximating the likelihood directly, but we could also use this mixed approach to approximate the posterior directly. And this is useful for computational models that have mixed parameters. So not mixed data, but mixed parameters. So for example, they would have continuous parameters and also some discrete parameters in the model. That the discrete parameters might maybe turn off some model components. And then we can use MNPE, mixed neural posterior estimation, to perform or to obtain the posterior over these models. And another really exciting feature that's really only a couple of weeks old is that MNLE can now be used in Pyro. And I'm not sure how many of you are using Pyro or are familiar with Pyro, but and if not, then this might not sound so exciting. But it's really Pyro is a probabilistic programming framework where they have this really compact way of defining these inference problems. So they usually have these constructs called Pyro plate, where you can just say, okay, I have num subject subjects, so I have 10 subjects. Every subject has n trials, and then I can really define my model, and then I can do inference. And it's really like a high-level representation of this really complex experimental setup. And that's all the code that we have to write. And internally, Pyro will take care of all the dependencies and conditional dependencies between these different observations. And this Pyro usually works only with known distribution objects like Gaussians or really like tractable distributions. But now we have a wrapper that allows you to train your MNLE object on any simulator that has no likelihood representation whatsoever, but we can obtain this approximation to the likelihood. Then we can plug it into the wrapper and then use it in Pyro. So really, we build this bridge from SBI to Pyro that you can now kind of apply Pyro to all kinds of interactable models. And that's really exciting. I hope this will be applied soon. Okay, so with that, I come to the end. I just noticed now that I took longer. I'm sorry for that, but I hope we'll have some time for questions now. And of course, I want to thank all the institutions that were involved in this. And I thank you for your attention. I really encourage you, if you are working on simulation-based modeling, have a look at this Python package called SBI, and yeah, reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Jan. I'll unpin here. I think in terms of time limits, because of the technical difficulties at the beginning, we won't be able to do many live questions, but I'm going to have people forward them to me. And if it's okay, I might forward them to you, Jan, and we can get an answer that
Yes,
way.
of course.
Awesome. Thank you. But yeah, this has been really incredible, and it's so exciting to hear that there are new developments in kind of already established research. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone in the audience. Again, please feel free to send the questions, and please stay connected with Women in AI and Robotics. So thank you. All right. Stop recording.